in the hushed echo of a medieval manor, amidst tapestries heavy with faded glory and the scent of beeswax. Life unfolded according to strict lines of privilege. Every corner, every fixture was designed not merely for habitation, but as a statement of insurmountable status. And nothing spoke of that station quite like the careful management of one's bodily necessities. For the aristocracy, waste disposal was not a mere function of biology, it was an architectural and social performance. To possess a private latrine, a privy chamber, if you will, was to declare oneself removed from the common filth, separated by stone, design, and sheer wealth. It elevated the necessity into an art form of inconvenience. Imagine, if you can, the visual spectacle. Elaborately carved woodwork, sometimes featuring mythological beasts or heraldic symbols, framing a simple collection basin. These private chambers were masterpieces of designed isolation, places where even the most primal biological urges were enclosed and given architectural dignity. They promised containment, exclusivity, and a fragile sense of hygienic superiority. Yet, these gilded enclosures harbored their own specific set of logistical nightmares. The act of using them was fraught with implied ceremony, the proper linens, the discreet calls for service, the understanding that one's biological output, while contained, remained an immense logistical problem. To be privy to such luxury meant also being confronted by its inevitable crudeness. The early systems were ingenious in their intention. Chutes leading to septic tanks or open ditches outside the main walls. The idea was clear. The sewage flowed away from the delicate order of the court into a designated, distant receptacle. It was a systemic attempt at purification through distance. But the material reality of medieval plumbing was far less poetic than its design suggested. Lead pipes could corrode, drainage channels clogged with soap scraps and accumulated grease, and the sheer density of life concentrated within city walls meant that a way often became dangerously close. The system worked beautifully, or so the architects believed, until it inevitably failed. The very concept of plumbing in high society was a declaration of mastery over nature, but it only delayed confrontation with reality. When those engineered systems backed up, when a drain failed, or when the cesspit overflowed its carefully appointed banks, the result was not merely an inconvenience. It was a visceral assault on all who lived within its elegant walls. And so we find ourselves introduced to the great separation, the noble household versus the outside world. The aristocracy attempted to build microscopic utopias of sanitary control, believing their expensive plumbing and highly controlled waste disposal methods protected them entirely from the messiness of existence. They separated themselves, both physically and culturally, from the uncontained reality that lay beyond the castle walls. This early chapter sets up a profound tension: the gap between aspirational hygiene and biological necessity. It is a narrative of carefully maintained illusion, where elaborate design shields us temporarily from an utterly fundamental messiness. We are learning, even now, that in the medieval city there was no true separation, only temporary, fragile containment. If the wealthy found an acceptable way to manage their excretions within the fortified walls of a manor, life did not become significantly cleaner simply because they had moved indoors. Indeed, once the waste left the controlled environment of the private privy chamber, it met the glorious chaos of the medieval street. The city itself was, in essence, a vast, perpetually clogged drainpipe, and its inhabitants were both contributors and victims. The elaborate cesspits and ingenious latrines designed for aristocratic convenience had a limited scope. They protected only those who could afford to build them. Everything beyond the palisades, the markets, the workshops, the narrow alleys teeming with life and commerce, was subject to an entirely different set of plumbing rules. None at all. Here, waste was not merely contained, it was simply added to the general runoff. The true picture of medieval sanitation is one of brutal overflow. Imagine a crowd amassed in a marketplace, haggling over silks or spices, their passage creating both human traffic and biological runoff. There were no designated dump points by modern standards, only convenient ones determined by necessity and habit. The refuse, spilled ale, discarded scraps of food, general gutter grime, all mixed inextricably with the inevitable solid waste. This was not an accident as much as it was a fundamental component of urban existence. The resulting mixture formed sludge that coated cobblestones, pooled in ditches, and soaked into the very foundations upon which these magnificent, congested cities were built. The street-level experience was therefore one of deep contamination, a constant reminder that the pristine veneer of high society could not extend even 20 feet from their gilded gates. The sheer logistics of living so densely packed meant that human waste did not simply vanish. It found new homes and mutated into a ubiquitous feature of city life. When rain fell, these accumulated street-side deposits did more than merely wash away grime. They created an olfactory tidal wave, sweeping the stench across narrow passageways and congregating at river edges. The street itself became the ultimate refuse receptacle, a giant open-air basin for everything from exhausted animals to discarded filth. It was a visceral reality that directly challenged any pretense of sanitary elegance. The wealthy lord might enjoy his discreet little chamber, but out among the merchants, porters, and apprentices who fueled the economy, sanitation meant simply trying not to track it into your own doorway. This common dumping was a deeply communal act of biological surrender. There was no singular culprit. Rather, there was the collective metabolism of humanity, happening in close proximity. The stench that permeated everything, the smell of unwashed bodies mixing with market refuse and raw sewage, was simply the scent signature of survival itself. It saturated clothing, settled into porous stone, and remained a constant companion to every breath taken within the urban sprawl. The lines separating acceptable filth from mere necessary pollution were extraordinarily blurred. A nobleman could complain about the stench emanating from an unwashed worker or a neighboring dwelling. Yet, he was living literally on top of accumulated refuse, benefiting from the same general lack of effective drainage that rendered his finest plumbing ultimately insufficient in the long run. The consequence of this unsanitized level of dumping extended beyond mere discomfort. It was an epidemiological hazard waiting to erupt. The mixing of human waste with food scraps and animal effluent created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and countless other intestinal scourges were not merely random occurrences. They were logical outcomes of the environment itself. Cleanliness, in this context, was a luxury so ephemeral it barely existed. Thus, we learn that the city streets formed an incredibly complex and multi-layered sewer system, far grander and infinitely more disgusting than any modern analog. It operated through simple gravity and sheer collective negligence. And while the private chambers were architectural statements of class superiority, the streets revealed the unavoidable biological truth. Humanity, in its dense congregation, is fundamentally a mess, eternally depositing waste into the public sphere. From the glittering illusion of the Privy Chamber came a biological spillover, a consequence the architects and aristocrats were never quite ready to face. The problem of waste disposal did not end at the decorative chute. It simply relocated, pooling inexorably beneath the foundation of luxury. To understand the medieval body's relationship with filth, we must descend, physically and metaphorically, into the vast network of cesspits. These subterranean vaults were the true, unsung plumbing infrastructure of high society, a dark underbelly to the elegant lives lived just above them. Think of it as an underground municipal service for excrement. These pits were rarely confined to single households. They served entire blocks, or even small quarters of nobility. They represented a horrifying convergence of immense human volume and deeply inadequate containment technology. The expectation was one of continuous, contained management, yet the reality was far more visceral, cyclical, and often catastrophic. The life of the cesspit was defined by overwhelming proximity to organic decay. Every aristocratic function, every meal, every late-night indiscretion, every mundane biological necessity contributed directly to this slowly filling repository. The pits did not just collect solid waste. They were absorbing the entire excretory output of an entire social class, trapping it beneath impermeable layers of stone and packed earth. The smell was not merely bad, it was chemically aggressive. It was a composite bouquet of stale urine, semi-digested matter, volatile organic compounds, and the deep, cloying perfume of methane gas waiting for release. Imagine sealing an entire neighborhood's digestive processes into one confined space. The air itself became saturated with an inescapable miasma that defied simple description. It hung low, clinging to damp stone walls, a silent testament to human consumption. The architecture around these cesspits was built on willful denial. The pits themselves were engineering marvels of containment failure. They were designed for disposal, but their very existence dictated the living conditions above them. Families lived in uneasy truce with this ticking biological time bomb beneath their floorboards. Maintenance, far from being a routine chore, was an immense logistical and economic undertaking. Blockages were inevitable, a combination of excess volume, undigested material, fatty buildup, and seasonal fluctuations in usage that overwhelmed the design capacity. The sheer scale of accumulation meant that these cesspits operated under perpetual duress. They reached critical mass not with a sudden dramatic plumbing burst, but with a slow, sickening creep toward overflow. The struggle was one of endurance against biological reality, a continuous battle between human activity and porous stone. When the pit filled, nothing could be done simply by waiting. It required costly, disruptive pumping or emptying. The deepest dread surrounding these structures was not just the smell, but the contamination. This waste did not simply vanish into the earth as modern myths suggest. It seeped. Over time, the porous nature of medieval ground allowed nutrient-rich sludge to leach out, contaminating shallow wells, affecting surrounding foundations, and fundamentally changing the local hydrology. The wealthy lived upon a constant foundation of biological hazard. The cesspit transformed from mere disposal unit into a silent barometer of social life itself. Its maintenance schedule reflected the household's wealth and stature. A minor blockage in a lord's private privy might be an inconvenience. A massive, overflowing collapse of the main family cesspit could signify profound systemic failure, economic hardship, overpopulation, or simply too much feasting. Furthermore, these pits were inextricably linked to belief and superstition. The proximity of death and waste often warped cultural understanding. Disease, sudden blight, even misfortune in the house could easily be blamed on an ill-maintained pit or a gas escaping from below. It was a physical manifestation of cosmic disorder right beneath the parquet flooring. When the cesspit finally needed emptying, it was not a clean, clinical process by today's standards. It was brutal, manual labor carried out under appalling conditions. Workers, often relegated to the lowest social strata, the muck diggers and pitmen, faced noxious fumes, physical exhaustion, and unimaginable biohazards. They were men whose intimate knowledge of waste disposal granted them a necessary, yet deeply despised, authority over high society. Their labor was essential, invisible, and profoundly odoriferous. The process often involved hauling vast quantities of night soil, sometimes miles away from the locus of contamination. This material, now viewed through an economic lens, represented one of the most potent resources in the medieval economy. After being extracted and processed, it was marketed as invaluable fertilizer. The very elements considered disgusting were reclaimed and transformed into wealth, the dark cycle of pollutant to commodity. The contrast between the luxurious life lived on the ground floor, adorned with tapestries and fine furniture, and the primal, stinking chaos stored beneath them is staggering. It highlights a fundamental hypocrisy in medieval existence: the commitment to surface-level perfection while managing underlying biological decay at an industrial scale. The Cesspit Chronicles are thus not just about plumbing. They are a testament to human resilience against the most inescapable of physical realities: the sheer, unstoppable volume of biological life itself. They show that even when kings and queens commanded empires, they remained fundamentally tethered to the cycle of waste, demanding its containment, managing its smell, and ultimately profiting from its residue. The aristocracy lived in a state of controlled biological fantasy. They had constructed elaborate structures designed to separate the bodily needs of nobility from the grime and chaos of the street. The very act of disposing of waste became, in its own right, an architectural performance, a statement of untouchable refinement. But these elaborate systems were fallible. They relied upon gravity, on perfectly graded gradients, and on pipes that, over centuries of use, inevitably gave way to the unstoppable forces of biological reality. What happens when a sophisticated drainage system encounters not mere waste, but an overflow event? When plumbing itself becomes the site of social disruption and physical calamity, we must consider the moment the gilded facade cracks, the moment the meticulously maintained flow breaks down. This is where sanitation ceases to be merely inconvenient and instead becomes a spectacular, unavoidable disaster. Picture a manor house at its zenith of opulent living. Hundreds of people move through its echoing halls. Feasts are spread across polished trestle tables. Powerful families convene under vaulted ceilings. The internal plumbing system, with its lead pipes, stone troughs, and cleverly concealed chutes, is designed to process the byproduct of this intense, concentrated existence. It functions smoothly enough until it doesn't. A blockage in a high-status building was never simply a mechanical issue. It was an indictment of the household's management, sometimes even its fate. The blockage signaled disorder, and disorder always had social repercussions. The immediate consequence of failure was not contained to the privy chamber. When the main drains clogged deep within the undercroft, or when a foundational sewer backing up forced material back through an ill-designed chute, the resulting effluent did not merely pollute a corner, it threatened the integrity of the structure itself. The noble plumbing system, meant to shepherd waste away cleanly and silently into some distant stream or cesspit, instead performed a dramatic act of rebellion. We are discussing architectural failure on a grand scale. Imagine the night soil backing up through a service drain, contaminating linens stored nearby, soaking into newly polished floors, or even forcing noxious currents back into the laundry chutes, turning fresh clothes into an unmentionable stew. The smell alone was physically assaulting, a thick wave of methane and decay that could overpower candle smoke and expensive incense. It was a scent that announced failure, poverty, or simply overwhelming congestion. The fallout from these internal plumbing collapses was profound. Everything stopped. Entertaining became impossible. Deep cleaning transformed into a panicked effort to manage structural biohazards. The sheer volume of material involved in even a moderate blockage was staggering, representing an immense, pressurized collective biological output that the stone architecture could no longer contain. The physical act of dealing with these internal collapses was messy and dangerous. It required specialized, grimy labor, the dreaded plumbers and drain clearers, men who saw themselves as navigating the filthiest arterial network of the city, while wearing protective gear made entirely of suspicion. They had to work in close proximity to sewage-soaked foundations, often armed only with hooks, buckets, and sheer desperation. These incidents were more than just maintenance calls. They exposed the fundamental hypocrisy underpinning medieval luxury. The greatest comforts, the elaborate lavatories, the indoor flushing systems, were also predicated on an incredibly fragile network of subterranean infrastructure. Beneath the veneer of imported stone tiles and carved oak banquets lay a circulatory system of filth that was prone to catastrophic failure. The result of these failures was not just stench, it was structural contamination. A sewer breach could seep into the foundations, weakening load-bearing walls and creating persistent dampness, which in turn accelerated the decay of wooden structures. The plumbing scandal thus became an issue of civic engineering, threatening not just decorum, but the very physical survival of the grand estates themselves. Consider also the economic dimension of this failure. When a blockage occurred, it presented a sudden, localized crisis that required massive amounts of manpower and disruptive resources, while the ideal outcome was the immediate removal of the material into deep cesspits or flow lines for later fertilizer processing. A true failure often resulted in immediate saturation and spillover. The economic calculation shifted rapidly from disposal to containment. cost associated with managing an internal blockage, the hired hands, the barrels, the delay in social life was astronomical, speaking volumes about the perceived value of undisturbed aristocratic comfort. In conclusion, the failure of medieval plumbing systems serves as a visceral reminder that high society's attempt to control its own biological reality was never truly successful. The sophisticated drainage network, designed to vanish into the earth unseen, instead became a dramatic and highly visible site of confrontation. It revealed the inescapable proximity between civilization and waste, demonstrating that even within the most magnificent stone walls, nature and biology always reserves the right to make an overwhelming, pungent mess. If the stench of the street was a communal disaster, then within the walls of aristocratic homes, bad smells were matters of social espionage. The noble household understood that the air itself could betray one's life. It became a form of architectural statement, as potent as the stained glass or the embroidered tapestry. Consider the prevailing theory. Even if you successfully concealed your biological realities underground, nothing, not scented candle, not costly perfume, nor fresh draft from an open window could truly hide the truth from keen nostrils. The human body was an odor factory, and in the tightly enclosed spaces of a medieval palace, scent became a weapon and a damning piece of evidence. The aristocracy didn't simply smell bad, they were judged for their odors. Odor was not merely a physical consequence of waste, it was shorthand for moral failure, poor health, or even political treason. To carry a specific bouquet meant something about your soul, and therefore your place in the rigid social order. The sense of smell itself was so deeply intertwined with medieval identity that the practice of perfume and aromatics reached levels bordering on industrial art. Perfumery houses were centers of immense wealth and dangerous innovation. The finest oils, spices from distant lands, exotic resins, all contributed to a desperate effort of olfactory camouflage. They didn't just mask odors, they sought to project an idealized image of purity and refinement onto the wearer and the environment. But this elaborate facade was constantly threatened by what came from below, from the Cesspit, from the poorly ventilated Privy, or simply from the natural exhalations of a large population crammed into expensive stone walls. The underlying problem remained. Human waste, rich with its potent biogenic signals, continually struggled to reach the exit, and its volatile compounds permeated everything. When things smelled wrong, suspicion immediately followed, and bad smells were rarely just about poor hygiene. In an age when plague was a constant dread, an unusual, deep-seated odor could be misinterpreted through a terrified lens. A sudden whiff of sweet rot or metallic decay might be ascribed to miasmata, the corrupted air thought responsible for disease. These theories gave powerful justification to those who wished to isolate the ill, blaming their very constitution for sickening the community. The blame game for smell was meticulously structured by class. The poor, living in overcrowded tenements and directly adjacent to unsanitary dumping grounds, bore a natural burden of odor. It was expected, considered part of their general station. But even within the elite bubble, an unusual or persistent scent could be highly problematic. Was it indigestion, a sign of moral decadence, or perhaps something far more terrifying, a bodily corruption that pointed to spiritual taint? Furthermore, specific biological processes were associated with social judgment. Certain illnesses, such as dysentery or advanced gut inflammation, carried telltale accompanying aromas that made discretion impossible. The bodies themselves became instruments of public shaming. If you smelled strongly, your status could wobble, leading to accusations of impurity and ruin. The ability to manage and dispel noxious odors was thus not merely a matter of domestic convenience. It was a performative act of social maintenance. Every grand manor had protocols: incense burning, complex ventilation shafts meant to draw fresh air from higher elevations, or the strategic placement of fragrant medicinal herbs. These measures were essentially attempts at olfactory control, an early, brutal form of reputation management. And so, we reach a profound realization about the power dynamic inherent in medieval sanitation. The disposal of waste was never just science. It was politics, theology, and perfume. It dictated who was considered civilized and who was deemed fundamentally unclean. If the noble air carried the faint scent of jasmine mixed with expensive spice, they were participating in civilization. But if that same breath drifted across the threshold, tinged with the unmistakable musk of untreated refuse or sickness, then one faced not just a bad smell, but an indictment of their entire existence. The nose knew best, and it had no mercy. We have traced the path of refuse through every conceivable level of medieval existence, from the elaborately sealed chambers of the aristocracy, down into the foul embrace of the communal cesspit, and out into the choked gutters of the common city street. We established that waste was never merely a byproduct of life. It was an architectural problem, an economic commodity, and above all else, a deeply embarrassing social hazard. But in any civilization wrestling with its biological realities, something must be blamed when things inevitably fail to meet expectations. When the plumbing backs up, or the stench becomes unbearable, finger pointing is not just human nature. It is a fundamental civic mechanism. And in medieval Europe, blaming was an art form. The concept of blame for pollution was rarely objective. It did not simply follow the flow of effluent, it followed the lines of class and convenience. When the gutters ran foul, the rich deflected guilt onto the poor quarters. The masses, who lived cheek by jowl with animal stalls and market refuse, were expected to maintain a certain level of general filth, which served as convenient scapegoats for the occasional aristocratic whiff. But even among those of means, blame was nomadic. The great malediction in medieval sanitation was never simply the waste itself. It was the asterisk source asterisk of suspicion regarding that waste. The odor became evidence, a sensory indictment. If your house smelled particularly foul, a scent perhaps suggesting poor diet, insufficient ventilation, or worse, contagion, the assumption immediately fell on you. And if the smell persisted even after all precautions were taken, then blame had to travel outward, seeking something inherently less culpable. This is where the great literary fiction of sanitation comes into play, the innocent bystander. When a man smelled bad, it was not merely bad hygiene. It suggested moral decay, or worse, proximity to divine wrath. If an entire neighborhood suffered from chronic miasma, that pervasive, heavy stench believed to be exhaled by corrupt air, the cause could be anything, from political dissent deep within the household walls to unmanaged sewage pooling in a nearby field. The scapegoat was always chosen for its supposed lack of self-awareness and its unpredictable nature. In an age where natural processes were often viewed through the lens of supernatural malice or divine judgment, attributing filth to something beyond human intention offered psychological relief to the ruling class. Pigeons are prime candidates for such accusations. They nest in roof crevices. They roost high above drainfalls, coating noble architecture in layers of white, acidic guano. Their seemingly indiscriminate digestive output, a solid stain upon a pristine cornice, provided an easily identifiable and utterly non-human vector for filth. To blame, the pigeon was to perform a kind of intellectual sleight of hand. It allowed the noble household to point upward, far above their own cesspit depths, and declare that the contamination was not due to flawed governance or overflowing privies, but rather to avian negligence. The bird became a representative symbol for all chaotic, uncontrollable nature encroaching upon artificial, ordered human life. It is an exquisite piece of social architecture, an architectural distraction. This notion extended far beyond feathered creatures. Consider the common accusations leveled against itinerant workers, stray animals, or even natural forces like the river itself when its waters turned putrid. The poor, who had no plumbing rights and whose daily lives involved navigating literal filth, often absorbed these blamed stains. They carried the visible evidence of systemic failure, the soiled clothing, the accumulated detritus around their feet, and thus served as living reminders that the elegant structures above them were perpetually reliant on an underlying, unsightly mess. Their poverty became part of the civic miasma. The culture struggled deeply with this paradox. They needed the waste for fertilizer, They feared its mere existence as a stain or an odor. They benefited immensely from the refuse dumped by the lower classes, which fueled their prized crops and gardens, while simultaneously constructing sophisticated social mechanisms to deny any connection between that valuable pollutant and their own privileged well-being. Thus, we find ourselves at a peculiar crossroads of history, where scientific necessity meets profound spiritual paranoia. The simple act of relieving oneself becomes entangled with questions of moral fitness, economic viability, and who possesses the right to complain about the smells emanating from one's neighbor. Every whiff of excrement was not just biological data, it was social commentary. And every time a stench rose from a blocked drain or a nearby cesspit, the educated elite had an entire pantheon of fall guys, the birds, the poor quarter, the errant breeze, to absorb the blame, allowing them to maintain the illusion that their luxury was pristine, and their systems, while profoundly fragile, were fundamentally sound. This complex dance of pointing fingers ensured that nobody ever truly held accountable for the magnificent mess that defined medieval existence. Having navigated the luxurious failures of the Privy and descended into the oppressive dampness of the Cesspit, we arrive at the unexpected climax of medieval sanitation: its economic value. The human waste stream, so recently identified as a source of profound social embarrassment, structural peril, and olfactory dread, is in fact one of the most vital commodities in the entire economy. The stench that plagued the streets, the material that caused elaborate blockages beneath noble foundations, it was fertilizer gold. A brutal truth that shines a harsh light on the nature of high medieval life. The systemic hypocrisy at the heart of it all was staggering. The wealthy built their opulent existence directly atop and out of the literal excrement of the masses. Yet they treated this nutrient-rich material with utter revulsion the moment the waste left the confines of the castle walls and entered the open marketplace. Its function shifted completely. It ceased to be merely a biological accident. It became raw agricultural capital. And medieval society developed an incredibly complex, specialized infrastructure dedicated entirely to harvesting, transporting, and distributing this night soil. Imagine the scale, the output from hundreds of aristocratic dwellings, the very luxury that characterized our early chapters did not simply vanish into subterranean blackness. It was collected. Specialized tradesmen emerged, the waste gatherers, known variously by unsettling titles, who operated on a meticulously structured system of collection and trade. These were men of necessary grime, figures often relegated to the lowest social strata, yet whose service maintained the very stability and fertility of the entire agricultural economy. The pitman, or gleaner, was not merely clearing blockages. He was an extractive industrial laborer. His labor involved a sophisticated knowledge of drainage patterns, aristocratic habit, and agricultural demand. He knew precisely which properties yielded the most reliable source, and where that waste needed to go, the waiting fields just outside the city walls. The collection process itself was an undertaking of sheer logistics. It required specialized receptacles, often carts or tubs designed for maximum capacity while containing maximal stench. The materials were sorted, sometimes crudely, but necessarily separating what could be utilized from what constituted pure residue. This waste, or night soil as it became euphemistically known, was potent in a way that modern industrialized farming finds difficult to replicate without artificial inputs. It was concentrated biological matter, the perfectly balanced mixture of human detritus, rich with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the holy trinity of agrarian sustenance. To the farmer, it was miraculous. To the city dweller, it was an invisible ecological hazard. And to the elite, it was merely a regrettable necessity managed by others. The resulting economic bounty stabilized rural life during periods when natural fertilization methods faltered or were insufficient. Without this constant flow of anthropogenically generated nutrients, large-scale crop yields would have been severely limited, fundamentally altering diet, population density, and military potential. The variability of the great manors to feed their surplus populations hinged on the efficiency of their most unglamorous plumbing operations. This realization forces us to confront a profound truth about medieval class structure. Waste was not just an indicator of poor hygiene, it was quantifiable capital. Those who profited were those at the very top: the landlords, the manor lords, and the wealthy landowners who could afford the luxury of controlled pollution, while the specialized gatherers earned their precarious livelihoods by mastering the art of harvesting that same pollution. The cycle is complete. From the architectural statement of the Privy in Chapter 1, through the chaotic dumping of the streets in Chapter 2, down into the confined dread of the cesspit in Chapter 3, the catastrophic failure examined in Chapter 4, the judgmental sniffing contest of social status covered in Chapter 5. And finally, we reach this economic pivot point. Here, human excrement is stripped of its immediate filthiness, rebranded, priced, and circulated as a vital commodity. It is an agricultural mineral mined from the very foundations of high society. The narrative shifts from pure sociological disgust to grudging respect for man's biological efficiency. The sewage system was not just a means of disposal. It was an integral component of the regional food supply chain. The stench, which once served as evidence of failure or moral depravity, now has a market price. This dynamic sheds an unsettling glow on medieval life. Even in its most base and biological functions, everything held a profound, measurable economic value. And that lingering realization that the things we consider merely waste are often foundational to civilization itself is perhaps the darkest and most enduring lesson of all. The economy of waste had already been established. We understood that what was loathsome effluent in one context could be gold in another. The nutrient-rich sludge, the night soil hauled from the deepest cesspits and piled high for agricultural use, was a silent, constant engine driving the gears of medieval civilization. But this commerce of decay required specialized hands, professional labor, the Sanitation Syndicate. These were men who navigated the unseen arteries of human habitation, traversing the filthy underbelly that supported the glorious facades of noble life. They were not merely dumpers. They were the critical infrastructure workers of an era that had no concept of sewage management as a profession. Their existence was defined by perpetual proximity to decay, making them necessary anti-heroes in the great social drama of medieval living. Consider the sheer scale of the task. A sprawling urban center like London or Paris did not simply generate waste. It created millions of biological units per day. This residue flowed from every luxury privy chamber into massive underground reservoirs, the communal cesspits that functioned more as subterranean swamps than mere septic tanks. The process was relentless, cyclical, and deeply malodorous, and when the noble lords decreed a fresh deposit or needed their valuable fertilizer harvest, they called upon these men. They were skilled in the art of extraction. They possessed tools not designed for heroism, but for deep biological retrieval. Buckets, specialized shovels, and stout carts built to withstand an acidic slurry. Their knowledge was encyclopedic, covering everything from identifying natural gas leaks beneath the cobbled streets to predicting which cesspit had reached critical overflow capacity without even opening the lid. This expertise commanded a specific economic value, granting them a perverse sort of localized power within the rigid class structure. The life of the night soil man, often misunderstood and reviled by high society, was characterized by a grueling schedule and an acute tolerance for unimaginable filth. They worked in the early hours when the city slept or when the noble households were most secluded. Their passage through the alleys was a disturbing ritual, a parade of refuse. They navigated not merely streets, but topographical maps of human carelessness. Imagine the visual landscape: wooden-wheeled carts creaking over cobblestones, already slick with runoff, piled high with night soil that looked less like fertilizer and more like solidified swamp matter. This material, this black, steaming bounty, was hauled away from the gleaming status symbols and deposited at the outskirts of town, the great composting fields, where its value could finally be redeemed for a crop yield. Their role elevated them beyond simple laborers. They became custodians of secrets. They knew precisely which houses were emptying their waste too slowly, causing dangerous backups in the shared drain systems. They knew which nobility was running dangerously low on funding for proper cesspit maintenance, forcing them to illegally dump into public drains, a transgression that risked immediate social and structural calamity. This knowledge made them indispensable, yet simultaneously marginalized. The Syndicate operated through an intricate network of contracts and localized monopolies. Pitmen were often structured in guilds or semi-guilds, forming powerful economic blocs that governed the flow of waste both into and out of private properties. They dictated rates, stipulated acceptable dumping practices, and managed the volatile logistics of transfer from the noble's yard to the local staging ground, and finally to the distant fields. It was a business built entirely on biological necessity and aristocratic whim. To think that the grand feasts, the royal decrees, the pinnacle of refined culture, were fundamentally underpinned by the efficiency and labor of men scraping out decades-old night soil from sealed underground traps is profoundly unsettling. It shifts the entire axis of respectability. Their work was a constant confrontation with mortality itself. Every cubic foot of material they moved represented not just waste, but consumed life, the bodily residue that defined human existence. The odor, the primary physical marker of their trade, and an equally potent symbol of social failure to the elite, saturated their clothing, their breath, and indeed, the very air around them. They wore this stench like a badge of necessary grime, a biological uniform marking them as untouchable yet fundamentally critical. The system was inherently flawed, of course. While the profession provided efficiency, it also facilitated catastrophic accumulation when one manor's cesspit overflowed, or when an artery drain backed up due to misuse, perhaps by the noble, adding too much solid material when only liquid drainage was intended. The entire local plumbing matrix risked failure. The syndicate members were often tasked with emergency remediation, making them de facto civil engineers of biological disposal. They patched leaks in foundations and managed temporary drains that diverted noxious streams into safer, though equally offensive, channels. Furthermore, their relationship with the nobility was one of necessary contempt. The lords required the service, yet viewed the workers themselves as little better than the pollution they managed. This created a brutal class dynamic. The filthiest jobs were done by the lowest classes, while the most rarefied atmosphere and highest status remained attached to those who could afford to be farthest from the manure-laden cartwheels. It was a deeply ingrained social hypocrisy, where privilege required perpetual interaction with profound sewage management. The sheer volume of material processed suggested nothing less than an immense, invisible economy fueled by human digestion. The pitmen, therefore, were not just sanitation workers. They were resource managers, waste harvesters, and keepers of the foulest secrets beneath the gilded veneer of medieval society. Their skill set encompassed plumbing mechanics, volatile biohazard management, logistical planning across complex urban grids, and a superhuman ability to ignore an overwhelming bouquet of decomposition. They upheld the necessary fiction that high culture could exist in continuous balance with unimaginable filth, transforming human excreta from a simple pollutant into foundational capital for the next harvest cycle. It is through their gritty, unsung labor that we understand not just how they disposed of waste, but how fundamentally dependent medieval life was on its very management, even in the most gilded chambers, even when waste disposal was a matter of immense social ritual and painstaking ceremony. It never strayed far from the fundamentally biological. To understand medieval nobility is to accept that their greatest status symbol often coincided with their least hygienic necessities. The act of expelling solid matter became a performance, a carefully choreographed gesture meant to maintain the delicate veneer of civilized life atop an undeniably messy reality. This was not simply plumbing failure, but rather waste elevated to the level of ritualized artifice. The repository itself, the privy chamber, was less about sanitary function and more about conspicuous consumption. The sheer expense of maintaining a drain in every important residence was proof enough of one's wealth, but these systems required rigorous adherence to social etiquette. There were specific times for disposal, dictated by the rhythm of courtly life, and often specific materials associated with it. To messieurs, the privy was not merely an inconvenience. It was a breach of etiquette capable of causing scandal. The very timing under which one performed this essential function became subject to observation and judgment. Beyond simple biological necessity, waste acquisition sometimes held medicinal or spiritual significance. Certain bodily fluids were utilized in purported remedies. Physicians of the era operated within a framework that viewed much of human exudate through a lens of humoral theory, an inescapable connection between one's excretions and one's internal balance. Feces, for instance, could be analyzed not just as refuse, but as a diagnostic reading of the soul or the constitution. The ability to read the waste thus added an extra layer of occult meaning to what was already intensely private and deeply smelly. But the cultural significance deepened when we consider disposal rites tied to ceremony itself. Sometimes, particularly at funerals or during periods of intense religious mourning, specific rituals dictated how bodily materials, both human and otherwise, must be disposed of. These weren't just accidental spills, they were deliberate acts embedded in complex belief systems designed to appease spirits, mark transitions, or ensure spiritual cleanliness. The sheer banality of the subject matter contrasted violently with the solemn gravity of these rites. The most abstract form of waste disposal was the performative dumping that marked public ceremonies. While we focused earlier on the subterranean cesspit, sometimes the ritual mandated a more visible act of purification or elimination in a designated open space, often near the church grounds or the outer walls of the castle. This kind of publicly sanctioned polluting served to both cleanse and display power. By controlling where and how waste was eliminated in the name of ceremony, the ruling class reinforced its own mandate over the body, and by extension, over natural processes. The process required a complex network of intermediaries, those designated to carry out the ritual task. These were often not the noblemen themselves, but specialist cleaners or religious functionaries whose role was semi-sacrificial. They managed the transition from the private domain of high society into the public realm of ceremonial dumping. It was a necessary surrender of privacy to maintain the appearance of divine and social order. These rituals reveal a profound irony, that even when attempting to elevate an act, making it ceremonial, medicinal, or religiously required, the underlying biological reality remained utterly vulgar. The attempt to give dignity to excrement only served to highlight its inherent base nature. Status was thus maintained not through the elimination of the waste, but through the highly ritualized management and acknowledgement of its presence. Society could build towering palaces over lagoons of human decay because it had developed elaborate belief systems and social performance protocols strong enough to justify the stench, the risk, and the sheer inconvenience. The accumulated wisdom from these practices paints a picture far more nuanced than simply dirty. It reveals sophisticated systems of categorization, value assignment, and ritualized taboo. Waste was never merely trash. It was information, commodity, medicine, and sacred byproduct, all at once. The medieval nobleman did not just excrete waste. He participated in the most intimate and powerful social technology, the controlled management of bodily elimination. And this mastery over biological messiness is arguably a more defining feature of their civilization than their magnificent tapestries or elaborate military formations. The journey through the unsanitized plumbing and forgotten bowels of medieval life is over. We have descended into cesspits. We have navigated blocked sewers, and we have measured the value of night soil against gold currency. The sheer magnitude of this undertaking, the daily, intimate reality of human excretion, sustaining vast aristocratic structures, is almost impossible for us modern people to grasp fully. If medieval life taught us anything about sanitation, it is that hygiene was never merely a scientific concern. It was always a volatile matter of class and control. The very act of doing nothing, of simply producing waste, was architecturally managed, economically exploited, and socially policed. We moved from the pristine marble fantasy of the upper-class privy chamber to the grimy subterranean necessity of the city drain, understanding that luxury itself had an invisible, toxic foundation. And here we stand, a millennium removed. We look at this historical deep dive into gastrointestinal etiquette and must ask, what has changed? Has our plumbing solved the fundamental problem of human nature? Our modern lives are saturated with clean water, sealed systems, and the reassuring promise of scientific progress. The smell of waste is now an industrial complaint, handled by municipal authorities rather than a personalized crisis for the nobility. We have traded the threat of the visible cesspit overflow for the unseen complexities of global wastewater management. The modern sense of disgust is vastly different from the medieval experience. Medieval disgust was primal. It was immediate, localized, and threatening to life itself. A bad smell signaled contamination, disease, and often a profound moral failure. It was an existential threat that loomed perpetually beneath the scented tapestries and perfumed air of the court. Today, our reaction to waste is mediated by systems we take for granted. We separate effluent from potable water. We neutralize pollutants on a massive scale before they ever approach a natural body of water. The sheer organizational effort required to keep modern cities relatively clean dwarfs anything imagined in the smoky grandeur of a late medieval manor. The plumbing, in theory, has perfected everything. We have achieved unimaginable feats of engineering that render the horrors of the pitman's life an almost unbelievable chapter in human history. Yet, as we draw this final breath on our historical examination, a profound stain remains. The stains are not merely chemical or physical. They are inherent to us. The knowledge we have acquired shows that civilization is predicated upon a massive and often invisible waste throughput. The energy of empire, the weight of culture, the splendor of a renaissance, feast, all of it required mountains of excreta to maintain the agricultural base upon which those splendors were built. We replaced the pitmen with engineers. We replaced the local dump site with the treatment plant. But the principle remains stubbornly constant. Human activity necessitates the removal, processing, and containment of biological effluent. The deep flaw in our modern self-congratulation is a tendency towards historical amnesia. We forget the sheer precariousness of everything we enjoy. The flawless flush, the crystal clear running water, the very air that feels clean, all are artifacts of continuous, grueling management of what was once viewed with terror and revulsion. The lesson here, perhaps more than any specific piece of plumbing failure or lucrative manure haul, is a recognition of humanity's enduring capacity for mess. We built breathtaking social structures, monarchies, universities, grand opera houses, and scientific institutions. And every single one of them, at some point in their history, relied on the same foundational biological necessity that brought forth the stench-filled narratives we have so thoroughly explored. The sophisticated attempt to sanitize existence, the architectural desire to build a perfect, odorless world, is fundamentally flawed because it ignores the raw, messy, uncontrollable output of life. The palace sought to wall off decay. The city attempted to redirect it into canals, and we now seek to chemically purify or recycle it out of sight. Yet, beneath these layers of engineering genius lies the timeless reality that biological processes are non-negotiable. No matter how much velvet curtaining we hang over the smell, no matter how elaborate the flushing mechanism becomes, the output persists. The attempt to entirely eliminate human effluence is not only economically impossible, but biologically futile. So, what is the enduring stain? It is a reminder that civilization has always been an exercise in controlled pollution. We are built upon a magnificent foundation of discarded waste, whether it was fertilizer gold sold by gleaners in the 12th century or the vast chemical processes operated within concrete walls today. It asks us not merely to be cleaner, but to be more aware to recognize that our deepest comforts and highest cultural achievements rest upon an ecological metabolism that is messy, brutal, and utterly constant. The Privy Chamber was never just a status symbol. It was a monument to the careful, ongoing management of inescapable reality. And perhaps that uncomfortable truth, the stain we cannot truly wash away, is the most vital lesson history